Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are going to be showing off two new, relatively advanced bots. The sort of thing you use once you've gotten used to the others. And of course, because of this, the stream is going to be basically one half of bot 1 and the other half of bot 2. But I'll be following the same system as I normally do for each of them entirely separately. So that means that first of all we'll be discussing why the bot is built the way it is, comparisons to the CPU and what you can get out of using the CPU, if anything, and overall goals before then going into the specifics of the inputs available, any special notes, and the point system that you use for the bot. This may take a little long today because these bots, while their inputs are actually relatively easy to do, they're relatively difficult to explain. And while we normally don't put a lot of effort into explaining it and just put it on the website instead, today it takes a little bit more effort. So, on to reasons why we might build advanced bots. Generally, advanced bots are here to cover pretty much everything. That's the way it was in Street Fighter V, and generally is the way it is for all of our bots in other games. If a bot is listed as advanced, chances are it probably lets you cover as many things as possible. And most likely, the character is a character that has a lot of options and should probably be considered fairly strong, at least at whatever it is that they specialize in. If you have a character that overcomes that easily, they're probably not very hard. If you have a character that is only normal relative to them in their skill set, you're going to have some problems, and therefore you might want something to help you train. Cammy in particular has a lot of options. She can attack a lot of spaces on screen. She can put herself in positions where she's advantaged enough to actually be a threat without you necessarily being able to react to it. And some of her stuff can be relatively hard to react to. As what most people consider a footsies character, especially in a game with less strong pressure options, one of the things that Cammy is generally trying to do is control the space in front of her with her normal attacks. Her special attacks, while they are useful and definitely good for combos, aren't necessarily the things that most Cammy players will be just randomly doing, or if they are, they're punishable enough that once you've learned the basics of punishing them, you probably don't necessarily care. In fact, if you've learned punishes in general, you probably don't need to train with Cammy specifically in order to get good punishes on Cammy's special moves. This is even more true if you are used to our Cammy bot from Street Fighter V, because she hasn't been changed that much as a character in terms of her game plan. Mostly it has to do with how she executes specific things and things that add onto it from the game's universal systems. So, while you've been watching the bot itself do all its stuff for all this time, that's probably not even a fraction of what the bot actually does. And by contrast, we'll show you quickly why we'd made a bot like this as compared to the Cammy CPU. Generally, we suggest that you do the CPU either at level 6 or 7. In this case, we'll use 7 because footsie characters need to make less of a specific type of mistake in order to be effective as CPU form. Easy job. While she's good at defense in general, by the very nature of the character, if she's going to be using up all her energy, you could probably learn to parry a bunch of things, or just move yourself through her various attacks. But we've always been concerned that the CPU will just quote-unquote read your inputs. It's not really deciding whether or not the thing it's going to do is a good idea, but simply detecting what you did, and if it has an option quick enough to deal with it, then doing that. Part of the problem with using it this way is that a player doesn't necessarily make the same type of mistakes as the CPU does. And you may end up frustrated because players do things that are less reasonable or logical, but you haven't practiced punishing those things if your main opponent has been the CPU. And of course, characters that have a lot of options cause a different problem in the CPU space simply because they do too many things, and when you are trying to figure out why you want them to stop doing it, they just will stop doing it anyway. You don't actually convince them to stop doing it by punishing anything, they just don't do it because it's not the right thing to do. And this is a problem when it comes to learning things against players, simply because players generally aren't like this until you get to the very highest levels. In short, it doesn't repeat the mistake consistently enough. Training is usually a lot better when the enemy will repeat the mistake, but not often enough that you can just wait for it every time. So you're stressed, but you know that eventually it will happen. With our advanced bots, you cannot even be entirely sure of that. Because, again, it can take really long for the mistake to be made simply because of the nature of the bot. But if you want to train against Cammy as a generality, there's not too much downside to the CPU if the bot is either not to your liking or too difficult to input somehow. So, let's go back to that. You can see here, bots are useful in the sense that they can do things like overcommit or create the same scenario over and over. So let's go into a little more detail about why she's built to do any specific thing. Being a footsie character with options like that, one of the things you generally want to learn against Cammy is how to make sure that when you do manage to hit her in neutral, you can convert this into damage. And similarly, if you hit her but know that you can't convert it into damage for whatever reason, you can't continue your combo or set up a positive situation for yourself, then you would want to make sure that when she counterattacks, you don't get hurt. And this is particularly true because if she does block something you were doing, she has generally got fast enough normals and enough options that you might need to parry something. She tends to stand at a space where she's more likely to be parryable than she is going to be throwing you. And we didn't make this bot about the throwing you part. Technically, actually, it is Honda that managed to get that slot this time around. So a lot of your goal is not just reaction and spacing, but understanding that because you have put yourself in a particular position, you can in fact predict about how long it would take for your opponent's button to reach you, and therefore parry some of the stuff they do. Generally, this is only true after you've actually hit her in some way. So you can think of it as training to recognize when you have failed to do your combo or your defense correctly. You've poked and landed a hit, but not gotten enough out of it, and therefore that you need to parry. She also has certain other moves that technically are long enough startup that you could probably figure out whether or not you needed to parry them on reaction, like that. But it's not necessarily as easy to do. You are still somewhat guessing. Still, it's worth training up. And with the number of other things she's capable of doing, particularly in footsies, you will learn a lot about it, which is useful. Most of her points are actually about this. We do have a specific thing to note later on about the inputs, so let's go into that now. But it's all the way in Action 7, so you don't actually need to care right away. So we're now moving into the segment of explaining the inputs. You can see on the screen for a moment the frames required for most of these, but these are the type that tend to manage themselves by just, you try to input the thing and it almost always takes exactly this long. If you find yourself taking much longer than this, the bot may be a little bit less effective, but most of the time for advanced bots, we are going to assume that you already know what you're doing. Otherwise, you should probably be inputting our Ryu bot instead and starting there. So, what you see on your screen now is her Action 1. This is a 1 heavy punch, and this does... It's a lot better if this is the first frame. You're holding the heavy punch for the entire input. Right after you let go of down back, you let go of 1, and neutrally press medium punch plus medium kick. You only need to tap this once, while continuing to hold heavy punch, and then quickly tap up forward and end the recording. Similarly, her Action 2 is also quite quick and relatively easy. Here, we are kind of showing off that this input does not have to be perfectly done, because technically that is supposed to be a light kick plus medium kick, but that light kick plus medium kick does not need to happen together on the very first frame. For most uses, there will be what they call a plink if you've only pressed the medium kick for 1 frame before the light kick comes in. And this is useful because you'll be trying to hold this medium kick the entire time. We suggest moving around your buttons to whatever is the easiest to hold. It's a lot less stressful to just go into the control settings and change your buttons than to make yourself do all of the work trying to get it over and over again with the button setup. So, down back, medium kick plus light kick. Hold the medium kick the entire time. While you're still holding down back, a few frames later, press throw. And that light kick you see there is just releasing the throw input a little slowly. You can do this by just setting a throw button instead. But again, this is here to show that it is fine even if there is a little bit of leniency issue here. And then quickly after that throw, technically hidden within that throw's animation if the throw were to happen, which it generally doesn't, from down back, do a quarter circle forward and end the recording. It's okay if your recording goes a little bit past and there's a little neutral point with just holding the medium kick. It doesn't have to end exactly at forward, but you should try to be pretty quick about it, basically the same way you do any other quarter circle forward move. As this is an advanced bot, I'm not really trying to explain to you what these are supposed to do, because they're all multiple combinations of things. This one is almost exactly the same, except that instead of down back, medium kick plus light kick, you start at down forward, medium kick plus light kick. And once again, you hold the medium kick. In this case, you're pressing forward plus throw. But you don't actually have to press forward because it's the same thing. I'm letting you know that it's fine to press forward plus throw because you're going to do a half circle backward after that. So tap throw, do half circle back, and as you can see from this, there's a lot of overlap between these inputs. All you care about is that you're holding the medium kick at the end and you get your half circle back. Try not to hold the throw, but generally people do not end up holding it. This input is a little bit more complicated for multiple reasons. And don't be too surprised or confused if your character doesn't actually do the backdash here, because you're not really trying to. Nor are you specifically trying to get that back jump in there. Again, we're accepting this relatively incorrect input just so you can see very clearly it's okay if it has some messed up parts or leniency. The important parts of this input are that you press back medium punch followed by back heavy kick, and you hold both of these until the end of the recording from there. Part of the reason for this has to do with how Cammy does a specific target combo cancel, so I'm going to play it from much closer. Hopefully that makes it make a little more sense. It is back medium punch, back heavy kick, and because it's a target combo, it lets you hit the heavy kick way earlier than the heavy kick actually happens. After that point, you simply press up forward, and then once again, from that up forward, do a half circle back. In combination with other things, it'll let her do a target combo into a cannon strike, for example. This relatively simple input is another of do this on the first frame, hold a button. In this case, you're holding the heavy punch until the end. But while you start by pressing heavy punch plus heavy kick together, you release the heavy kick and then press it again relatively quickly. As you can see here, there's only a 6-frame gap between the two of those. And after that, once again, you're just doing another half circle back while holding the heavy punch. If you get this done on the first frame, for those of you who are not familiar, part of the reason for this has to do with how the game reads inputs for held buttons. You'll notice here that Cammy no longer does either a drive impact or any heavy punches. This is because as long as you are holding that heavy punch, the game will not activate the heavy punch again. So even when it loops back around to the beginning of the input, which is just heavy punch plus heavy kick, it will only read it as a heavy kick. And this is important for her general flow. This is why a lot of these inputs, particularly ones that start with heavy punch, are what we call first frame. There will be an explanation on the webpage as to how exactly to get this done easiest if you have difficulty, but it's been a little bit easier lately because the game doesn't actually keep the very first frame of input sometimes now. So if you tend to get just one frame of a direction or something at the beginning and you look back at your recording and it's there, don't worry about it. Try replaying it to see if it's actually there or not, because sometimes it's no longer there when you replay. For action 6 then is relatively simple as well. A light punch followed relatively quickly by a heavy punch. The exact number of frames between these isn't too important, but 4 seems to be a good space, which is around the point most people will do if they're moving their hand from one button to another. And then you hit throw. Note again that plinking the throw, as it's called, that one frame of just light kick before you see the light kick plus light punch together, this is completely okay, and it will always result in the throw input, not the light kick input. And once again, we're doing a half circle. In this case, we're doing the half circle forward, not back. And end the recording. We've now reached slot 7, which is easy to do but very hard to explain. So for those who are not familiar with this, you can drive rush cancel certain normals. But the way you do your drive rush cancel from a neutral position is different from the way you do it in canceling in one way. that medium punch plus medium kick is not required. She will do the drive rush cancel just because you've tapped dash after the medium kick connects, the crouching medium kick here. But because we also want her to be able to do the same thing in neutral, we put the medium punch plus medium kick at the end along with the second forward for the dash input, so that even if she wasn't actually connecting the medium kick, but something else prevented the medium kick from happening, from animating, she might have a chance of just using her neutral drive rush. However, this specific input has caused us some confusion because of something else that I will explain in a moment. Her final action is relatively simple as well, a standing medium plus light punch. Hold forward a little bit, probably about the animation of the punch. You don't actually want her to move. You basically just want her to punch twice. And from there, just hold down back. But you are trying to hold that medium punch until the end of the input. All of these things combine in ways that are generally too complex to go into on a stream that is meant to be shorter. And again, if you're looking into bots, this is not the place to start. So I'm not going into it in detail, but we did find one thing that might be a problem for some people. We have enlisted the help of a person who is much more experienced at testing things relative to frames and labbing to figure out why it happens. It may not happen to you, and thankfully it does not happen that much on this recording. There is a way and timing for this recording to work where for some reason when Cammy cancels her crouch medium kick into her drive rush, it seems to just keep on choosing the same action again. We're not even sure if this isn't just an incredible streak of randomness, but please note that if your Cammy bot continually does either crouch medium kick or stand medium kick every time it cancels a drive rush, you may need to re-record it, but re-recording it isn't necessarily going to help. In short, we don't yet know the exact reason for this. And again, we've called in someone with more experience to investigate it if they have the time. But there's definitely something going on, so don't be too surprised if, as shown here, and I will change her drive gauge to just refill instantly in order to demonstrate it better. And I'm using the combination of slot 6 and 7. There is some scenario in which she will not do the light punch, and we are not sure what that scenario is. As soon as we do know with any certainty, or if we never figure it out, we'll probably make a note that we didn't figure it out too. Just understand that it's probably not your fault exactly if all you see whenever Cammy does her crouch medium kick into drive rush cancel is just the same move over and over again. But let's go back to discussing things from the perspective of the point system, therefore. And I'm not going to put her drive rush gauge back at the moment because it does slightly help with the explanation. The precise point system for this bot is mostly about hit confirms and parries. When you are at about this range to Cammy, She often does things that you will need to check. You need to press either a light button or a medium button, but you're also expecting her to approach you. And at the high levels, you run into the scenario where if she didn't approach you, sometimes it means that you can't actually land your combo because she didn't push herself forward enough for your button to be in range for comboing. The pushback, even if she didn't block, means that you might not be able to combo. Recognizing that this happened is relatively important because often she's a character who's fairly strong at choosing the right way to hit you just after that, and she does have options to do that for nearly everyone. So it's best if you can just parry based on the spacing you end up at and what you think you need to do. Characters have different options, you don't have to parry, but it does help train you in the mental flexibility required. If you personally are pretty sure that your character has a better option than parry that is also somehow safe, you can just use that one. But it does help training parries in general, so you should care at least a bit. She also has certain advancing moves and styles of move where you're better off stopping her in some way, but the exact way to stop her varies a lot. So while you don't necessarily get a point here for actually anti-airing Cammy specifically, you do get a point for stopping either her turn knuckle punch or her dive kick, in whatever way. Technically you get 2 points if you stop her turn knuckle by parrying it, for example. So you might want to check your character's options for dealing with it, simply because it's such a useful move in specific matchups or situations that you can generally assume that if the person can get away with using it, they're at least thinking about it. It goes a little bit further than most of the things she does, for example. Dealing with other aspects of her gameplay might be character dependent. So we're not absolutely ready to commit to the last option yet. Basically the fourth part of the point system, we're not completely confident that it's not character dependent. And therefore, for now, if you just want to test it out, probably go for something related to tacking her throw or avoiding her tick throws, as you call them. But if for whatever reason she nearly never gets into the range for that and you need to learn to stop something else she does consistently, then it's perfectly fine to treat the last part of the point system as that, as long as whatever it is something you consider fairly difficult to do but very important to the matchup for your character. This bot can do just about anything. And because she can do just about anything, the way you interact with her and which buttons she has available change basically from match to match. She's very constantly shifting. There are so many combinations of what she can do that there are some of them we weren't even sure she could do until today, and we're only speaking in theoretical terms. So also, you shouldn't be too concerned if your bot isn't necessarily performing exactly as you see here. She spends most of her time actually moving or locked in animations, which means that with most of the buffering types in the game, you don't really have to worry that the bot is terribly broken if your inputs are correct and not particularly slow. And that means that generally you can just try to improve your speed if you think a particular input was too slow, and that should fix it by itself. You don't have to be very specifically perfect about any of the inputs you see. But because of that, it's a little bit difficult to describe exactly what the bot should be considered to be good for beyond the point system. She just does so many things that, like most advanced bots, the only thing saving you is the fact that it's a bot. she'll stand there and whiff throw a couple times. Or depending on how you input certain things, she might back jump or neutral jump. And even those things are perfectly fine to have in here, simply because you can't be sure that they're not a way a Cammy player would play. And they're probably going to be rare enough in terms of her inputs that you're not going to necessarily get much out of trying to remove them and stressing yourself out. Just do your best to get whatever you can, inputs wise, and focus on your spacing, hit confirms, and in some cases, making sure your parries are on point. We'll have what we can manage of an in-depth session as soon as we have our Cammy player go through a lot more of her options. But watch out, because she can actually do super. It's just like a 1 in 4,000 chance that she'll actually do it, and only if she has Eater. So that's the level of sort of thing we're talking about. She has basically every option the character can meaningfully use, but exactly the situation where she has it, it's a little confusing to try to describe. And therefore, we're just going to move on right now, because there's no more I can say about it at this time. Which means we are now moving into the part of the stream where Honda is the one we're talking about. And we'll go with Marisa for a little bit more, and then swap out because of the specifics of what needs to be shown off here. So basically consider it to be run it back, we're starting over. And that puts us back at discussing why we built the Honda bot the way it's built. This is a very long explanation that will mostly be covered on our website in the in-depth section for the bot. But the basic understanding is that Honda as a character spends a lot of time keeping people at bay and controlling the space in front of him defensively with very strong, heavy attacks. And this means that he's often more committed than other characters. And in this specific game, being committed too much has a really strong downside. If your opponent could somehow know that you were going to try to check their approach with such a committed attack, they could theoretically drive impact through that attack, and unless you had a cancel that would allow you to quickly move into a multi-hit, you're basically not getting anything. You're going to get hit. Aside from that, once again, we've more or less tried to make sure that this bot can do pretty much anything you need him to do. And while he's relatively difficult to input in specific ways, he's not terribly hard to understand the inputs of, which is good. Basically, it's back to the same problem. The CPU doesn't make the same style of mistakes that a player makes. At least, assuming that player is intending to play in any way offensively, they're going to try things and fail those things. Whereas, the CPU doesn't so much fail as it does randomly lose. So I'll have our Marisa try to demonstrate the specific thing that we're talking about. When you're relatively far away from Honda, especially for example there after a knockdown, you need to cross the space between you and him, but you don't have a lot of good options for doing so just by jumping or dashing. He'll probably beat nearly any of these, which means you often drive rush from neutral. You can choose which way to do this. We suggest doing the forward dash version, but it really doesn't matter that much. And again, this is for when you're relatively far away. The reason is because once Honda tries to react to you using this drive rush to approach him, you can think of it this way. If he tried to use one of his large heavy buttons to check your approach, you could easily use your drive impact right away, because you can do your drive impact from your drive rush. Again, no, we're only talking about it from this sort of range, where you really need to get close to him, but you're like expecting him to headbutt, for example, if you try to just approach. And similarly, if you do choose to play the matchup in this way, just to know that you have the option, the bot is meant to help you understand just how quickly you will run out of energy doing this, how quickly you are likely to get burnt out doing this, which is a big deal against this character. So when he is close to you, mostly you're just fighting him normally. Punish what you can, get the knockdowns you believe in, neutral jump, or any other reaction you consider important. But once you've knocked him down and he's far away, or the player, theoretically, has retreated too much for you to easily get through his potential strong defensive normals, you want to go for the drive rush and then choose one of basically 3 options. Generally, you are either going to use your drive impact, whatever passes for a decent anti-air. For some characters this is a special move that takes you into the air, and for other characters it's just like their jab or medium punch. In Marissa's case I believe it is in fact just her medium punch, even if somewhat delayed. Or just throw, because if he reacts to a lot of the things you were doing by either defending or in his case trying to do his own drive impact or drive rush, a lot of the time he ends up being thrown for many reasons. The main reason this is helpful is because if you actually approach Honda with your drive rush and he does headbutt, and you either guess right or have incredibly good reactions, your drive impact will beat his headbutt, even the EX headbutt. And not only will it beat the move, it will stop him not airborne. You will be able to get a full combo from this, which is not what you might expect. But for contrast, let's once again check out what happens when you turn on the CPU, again at level 7. And you can, this is probably a lot better in terms of you being able to see the problem. He does a lot more things, and he, let's say, abuses some of the CPU's great capacity to either read what you're doing or space itself absolutely perfectly relative to a player. But this doesn't help you against a less skilled Honda. He does things that are not necessarily good ideas that you could punish, but beyond that you don't have much. Still, it's not useless to train against this. We've tried many times. In fact, we went for quite a while assuming that this was fine and we didn't really need to actually train against a bot or even make a bot. But it's still a very different feeling because, again, overall, this CPU is not really making mistakes that you could learn to punish. It's more so just reacting to the fact that you can't do certain things in time against a perfect opponent. It's very good for learning, though, just how much danger you're actually in if you can't do certain things correctly. And, fortunately, the point system for it works about the same. You can treat the point system for the bot entirely as the same, or at least the part where you drive rush at him when things are too far apart. But mostly, the CPU just does a ton of damage, and you can't necessarily get too much out of it. It does help you easily see, though, why you can't just quickly approach him by dashing or jumping a lot of the time. So, if you feel as if that is a thing you probably could get away with, try fighting CPU 7 Honda and see what options your character actually has for successfully doing this repeatedly. And this is therefore our timing for switching. We are going to leave it on CPU for a moment for much the same reason. So with a specific goal of playing some footsies and then when he happens to be far away for whatever reason, using the drive rush. You can see that overall, part of the reason why we came up with this specific method of dealing with him to begin with is related to the fact that he plays like this, and we technically only made the bot as a less perfect version of what the CPU already does. If you find the bot easy, even on the higher modes, duke it out with the CPU. You probably will have gotten good enough for that to work out for you. Things you need to care about, therefore, are making sure that you don't try to play footsies too much, because this sort of thing will happen. And that you air-to-air him correctly. Note I did not say anti-air, because while you can absolutely anti-air this character, it is not always a good idea to be relying on it because of his ways of tricking you, changing hitboxes, and he has a couple of good jump-in buttons that tend to overpower certain options people use. But as you can see, walking at him is practically a death sentence because most of us cannot react to headbutt in time. But we have learned that the drive rush input causes a screen freeze and an input freeze, both of which can help you get a little bit more edge in terms of getting close to him if you really need to. So you see it play out here a lot better. Rather than try to get in on him normally, just watch your gauge, because he is a defensive character, and a lot of the time, the thing he has to do in order to prevent you from getting any gauge is actually not that safe. He's also not super easy to parry, but easy enough that if you manage it correctly a few times, you'll gain a lot more meter, while still getting him into bad positions. So you can try to maintain your own drive gauge that way. Overall, it will be somewhat difficult to tell the difference between this and the bot if the bot is input correctly, and therefore you can just do the same thing either way. If you don't think you can get the bot input and you know you're already quite good at the game, just don't. Just use the bot's point system to train against Honda normally. But the one thing that this will not do as often, because the CPU for some reason doesn't, is go airborne because it saw you do the drive rush. And that is the last missing piece of the puzzle, because you sometimes need to react expecting or knowing that your opponent will go airborne. So let's switch back to the bot, now that the CPU has proven its absolute superiority, and deal with something that can actually be handled. For a moment before I go into discussing the inputs themselves. We've done our best to make sure that the bot has basically every Honda option. Some are used much less often than others, but if your inputs are pretty good, he should be able to do basically everything necessary. just with a little less finesse, let's say. And if your inputs aren't terribly great, then he still does most of the things. But most importantly, you see that neutral jump he just did. It won't necessarily come up often, but it is going to be in there, and that's going to be very important, because recognizing that your opponent could just jump is critical for the matchup, I would say, in multiple ways. Fortunately, the difficulty of inputting this character's stuff is more so about your understanding of charge timings than much else. The only other thing I would consider hard is making sure he jumps correctly, but even that can be just done enough times and re-recorded until it's working correctly. Options such as what you've just seen, the sumo, I don't know, we call it Praise the Sun, we should probably figure out what exactly that move's called. But you get the idea. That move doesn't actually have to happen. You can set the bot by changing one input whether or not it actually does. Which means it's now time to discuss inputs in general. As you can see, many of these inputs are a bit faster than you might expect them to possibly be, but this is more so because they're simple than because you have to be incredibly fast at it. His action 1 is just heavy punch plus heavy kick in order to do a drive impact, and basically the moment you hit that, press up for a little bit and then hold back. Around 20 frames is probably fine. Try not to press up back. You have time to entirely release up and then press direct back, and that be it. End the recording while holding back, and that's all you need to do. This is not actually meant to get you a charge in itself, but in combination with other things it might actually end up being enough of a charge. That's more so there just so he blocks a specific way. His fastest input is just up forward heavy kick with a light kick following right after it. Generally, this input can also be just a forward heavy kick. The important thing here is more so that you're holding the heavy kick than anything else. This is another one of those tweakable inputs that has a variant. If you do up forward heavy kick, it means he has more options to do different versions of his sumo splash. And if you're not necessarily quite quick enough to make sure that that light kick comes in right after, that's also going to come up. Holding the light kick is not actually required, but we have got it in this form to show you that it can be done that way. This input is also quite fast, but a little bit slower than you might expect given what it is. It's literally just a tap of forward, then another tap and roll to down. Make sure you're holding down when you end the recording if you don't want him to do certain moves. Oh, these will be explained in the page, but in general, if you want him to do his buff and his clap, possibly because you have that type of character, make sure to release the down direction for a very short time before ending the recording. His action 4 is also relatively simple. It is down heavy punch. You can use down back again if you don't want him to do things like his clap. And then a drive rush cancel from neutral. Note that his heavy punch does not necessarily drive rush cancel his crouching heavy punch. So just hold medium punch plus medium kick, tap forward a few times, preferably twice, but 3 is okay as shown here. And that's about it. He will generally not cancel this move, even if you hit him. But what often happens is that he'll parry for a moment. which is good because if anything stops him from animating the heavy punch, it means he'll just randomly parry sometimes. His slot 5 is similar and very easy. There's a more complex version of this, but we've chosen not to put it on this bot version and therefore not on the stream. It'll be described in the page as usual. You just need to do a crouching heavy kick. If you want him to do the buff, use straight down. If you don't want him to do the buff, use down back. Fairly soon after that, press down forward heavy kick and end the recording immediately. It's okay if you end up pressing forward for a moment, especially if you're still holding the heavy kick at the time. And you can again change his behavior depending on whether or not you hold that heavy kick until the end. Generally, we don't necessarily think this makes much of a difference though, because he doesn't have a lot of inputs that start with heavy kick, other than action 1. But if you're not familiar, here's why this is important. If you hold it until the end, when he switches from doing that to the other, he doesn't actually do the drive impact. He'll sometimes just do like another crouching heavy punch. Or in this case, another standing heavy punch. So it really depends. If you get it right, good. If you don't get it perfectly right, probably don't need to worry about it. His action 6 requires a first frame input. Specifically a first frame input of forward medium kick plus heavy kick. This can be a little bit difficult, but this is one of the times where the way that you do this, as it's described on our website, comes in the most handy, because the only thing you need to do after pressing that button and making sure to hold both of them is basically to hold down back. And you're holding down back for enough time to give him a charge, which in this case is 42 frames. I believe it can be slightly less, but you can test it fairly easily with one of the inputs we'll show later on. When this loops, if you have managed to get it first frame, he'll only do the forward medium kick heavy kick once, and then he'll just kind of wiggle forward like this occasionally when he happens to press that forward for 2 frames or so, and then go back to down back. Again, because if you are holding the buttons the entire time, the game never treats it as though you input those buttons, and he just never does anything like that. Here's his nightmarish input. This input is literally frustrating even for us, so please expect to be here for a while if you really want to get it perfect. This is partially because of the way the game does a specific aspect of input reading, but we're not going to go into detail on that here, it is not helpful. What you need to understand is that when you are doing this input, you are pressing up forward, then light punch for a bit, and you must wait a certain amount of time after pressing the up forward light punch before you press the light kick in order for this to work. Otherwise, he will do up forward light kick constantly, and you don't want that because up forward light kick is not an instant overhead. But because it can be timed so perfectly, there is a situation in which you can still use this to get his light sumo splash. This isn't important at all, but it's something that we put in here because it's more useful than not doing it. The important part here is to make sure to press those 2 buttons together, because there is a way to get it to use it as a throw input. And then we go further and input a second throw input. Note that between the up forward and that second throw input, you want to hold forward for a while. And getting yourself to do that for some people is very easy, and for some people is quite hard. On top of all that, this input has to be fairly fast. You probably want to end it before he even starts to land again. It will be difficult to watch it unless I put him on the other end of the screen, but overall, this input ends with Honda still quite reasonably in the air, especially if he hit We suggest doing this recording with the opponent in the corner. Note, of course, that if the opponent is all the way to the corner, this will definitely not cross them up. And that means that you won't have any problems with your forward input becoming a back input at any point. But other than that, all we can offer you is good luck with it, and it may teach you a little bit about the general way that Street Fighter takes inputs, particularly in recordings, but there's not much we can do to make it easier, and it's there to give you the equivalent of a tick throw, which he kind of needs, so there's not much way around it at this time. His final input is, thankfully, really simple. It doesn't even need to be first frame. In fact, it might be better if it isn't. It's just a forward medium punch plus light punch, and you're holding it until the end. But the reason you're holding it into the end is not to cause the same effect as you saw in slot 6. But, speaking of slot 6, let's combine the two of them. This is the easy way normally to test whether or not Honda has enough charge in his action 6. You just put him here and make sure he does not wiggle. If he doesn't wiggle even once, but can still just do headbutt, then he has enough for the charge. Technically, if you've input it correctly, since I don't think this game employs charge partitioning in the same way, it would still not work. But overall, you don't really care that much. Combining these two is the way to test whether or not Action 6 is working. And now we are back to the point system. We went into a lot of detail on that one. Other important things are dealing with his jumps in whatever way, but we strongly suggest air-to-airs. And the almost comically difficult in spirit but not in actual execution aspect of dealing with his throw, just his regular throw. He will occasionally do a regular throw, and you need to tech it. And if you're not particularly skilled at drive rushes and doing the predictions required for everything else, honestly that's probably the easiest point to get, and it's also extremely hard. So that tells you how difficult this bot is as a generality. Once again, the last point system, we're not entirely certain what it should be because it's possibly character dependent, as it often is for advanced bots. But we do have something in mind. You're still better off picking whatever you think is the thing that will help you the most in this matchup based on your character. Because you definitely need to air-to-air him. And you definitely need to deal with him trying to keep you out using the drive rush if you can. At the moment we have it set to something very simple. Give yourself a point every time you survive being in burnout. But this seems a little counterintuitive because the better you get at managing your meter, the less burnout you'll ever have. So, we're not totally sure this is a great point system to have in the long term for anyone trying to use the bot that's actually good enough to just parry things. Because you won't burn out if you are consistently correctly parrying things. On the other hand, if you are doing that, you probably don't care so much about the rest of it, and you can get the rest of your points anyway. So, it's probably the first point we'd remove in terms of stacking up difficulty. If you burn out and you get back to meter, because you're not supposed to set it such that it recovers automatically, you have to actually wait it out, then you get 1 point for just achieving that at all. And yes, this is even if all you want to do is just pressure him constantly, because he does have his super, even if you don't see him use it that often. And the more pressure you put him under, the higher chance that he's going to super you, or hit you with Oicho throw, or something of that nature that makes your life really miserable. But that does depend on character, and since we can't be sure that every character is going to actually have difficulty with this, we may change the burnout point. Or we may leave it in and just treat it as the easiest point and have you do as you like. You can use this bot for all sorts of other things though. Hit confirms, reading specific spaces, reacting with air-to-airs to positions you normally wouldn't be able to, parries themselves, confirming super combos, training yourself to not use your drive gauge for combos and instead use any super feature you have. You have a lot of options in terms of what you can learn from this bot, partially because the character is so strong. While I wouldn't say it's quite on the level of being able to learn by autopiloting, he's definitely the sort of character where you can notice a lot of things about yourself or your style that can be improved by paying attention to different aspects of the interactions between you and Honda. And most of that part does work even if you can't get the nightmare input correctly, as long as most of the first frame ones are correct. He once again does a lot of the things, but he doesn't necessarily do any of them very often. So you'll find yourself a little bit confused sometimes, because sometimes you'll absolutely do the right thing and sometimes you'll do something you really don't understand the point of. But that's just the nature of bots. If you wanted something else, the CPU is more than sufficient for making you strained in some other way. But while you are learning all of the various ways you can play around and with Punish Honda, please do bear in mind that most of the time, people aren't necessarily going to play like this. In fact, part of the reason for that back walk in Action 1, and your ability to make it quite a bit longer if you really want to, is simply because a lot of players will just walk away from you. Again, all of this is mostly stuff we're going to cover on what is likely to be a very long bot page. But overall, that brings us to the end of our stream for tonight, and we hope that HondaBot and CamiBot are helpful to you, particularly if you feel as if you've reached a skill level where you need something beyond Ryu and Ken. Overall, therefore, you can look out for more bots possibly next week, but we are planning to delay Zangief, for example, until Rashid's release. So if you were looking out for or hoping for our Zangief bot, don't expect it. We feel as if Zangief's changes, if he receives any, are likely to affect any bot we make far more than that tends to be for any other character. And, as we can probably demonstrate now, of the cast, we basically haven't covered Manon, Kimberly, Blanca, Zangief, and Dhalsim. And while obviously these characters are the type that we definitely want to do bots for, it seems relatively likely that if these characters in general get changed, the way their playstyle works means that the bot would probably be rendered, if not useless, much less effective. So we're going to wait probably until the Rashid release and any associated patch. So you should probably see us maybe in 2 weeks rather than 1 for the next disc guidance. We hope that all of our bots are helpful to you in some way. You can find them at our website 2-mk.org, SF6-bots for this particular game, and of course the navigation around that site should get you to anything you really want to know. You can find information on our bots, particularly our recent reaching out to ask about the CamiBot thing, on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC, along with information about when we'll be streaming our general Battle Lounge content or other disc guidance in the future. Usually we will send out our tweet at around the same time that we're starting the stream, namely 7:30 Eastern Time. So with all that, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.